So my main overarching belief is that we're all connected to something. And this ties into what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious, which is essentially everything that's ever happened in humanity is stored in our DNA, and we're all connected to each other through this collective unconscious. In 2019, I went to do my first Rebirthing Breathwork, and it was one of the most transformational things that I've done in my life up until that point. We're never going to get rid of evil. Evil is here with us, and we need to shine a light on it to be able to deal with it. And one of my purposes in life is to help myself become a better communicator, but help others become better communicators. Things that create really meaningful change, they take time, right? You can't just click a button and it happens. So this got me interested in abstinence. I decided to do 1 year, and after 1 year I felt great and have continued to stop drinking. So today's going to be a different format on the show. Normally it's me interviewing other people, but today I'm going to be giving my own story, talking about my own cosmic bridge and what this concept of the cosmic bridge is. So I think the main theme of the cosmic bridge really is about balance. One of the balances I'm always looking at is between materialism and spirituality. And why am I interested in this, you may be thinking? And I think a lot of it comes down to my profession. So I'm the founder of a sales consultancy and training company called Growth Genie. And often salespeople, we have this bad reputation of being seen as very materialistic, that we'd sell our soul to the devil, that we're like commission crazy people. But actually what I found in my career is the top salespeople are the opposite. They value things like truth and integrity. Of course, if you want to make a quick sale, you can do that without truth and integrity. But if you want to create meaningful relationships with people who come back to you over and over again, then you need to have different values. So I found this both in my work training hundreds of salespeople. The top salespeople are very honest, very open, and also with mentors as well. The people that have mentored me, they've had these values. But in sales, there are often things that we can't control, right? So even if you're the most skillful salesperson, you're going to hear the word no a lot more than yes. So essentially, you're going to be rejected a lot. And why I've liked sales is it's made me a lot more resilient as a person, because I'm getting rejected a lot in my daily life. But it can be difficult in those moments where you're getting rejected. Sales is one of the most stressful professions because of this. It's a very difficult thing to be in. So during those times, you need that resilience. And where does that resilience come from? And for me, it's never been from the material things, thinking I want to make loads of money. Of course, that's a great benefit of sales. But for me, there's been more of spirituality and faith that has got me through those moments. So going into that, my background is Catholic because my mum is Irish, or has an Irish background, and my dad is Welsh, but I grew up in London. And I'm a person that has always had faith, but I understand that in modern life, it's incredible in Europe that we have these cathedrals and these churches, and they're empty, right? There's obviously a gap with modern religion that people don't want to go to some of these most incredible buildings in the city. And then I've also always been interested in other forms of spirituality. I'm someone that goes to church maybe at Easter, maybe at Christmas, but I'm not religious in the sense that I go to Mass every Sunday, right? So I've always been very interested in other forms of spirituality. So my main overarching belief is that we're all connected to something that connects all of us. And this ties into what Carl Jung called the collective unconscious. So this is something that I'm going to be talking about a lot today. Now, Jung if you don't know him, he was a very famous Swiss psychologist, and he was mentored by Sigmund Freud, who's probably the most famous psychologist of all time. Now, Freud came up with the personal unconscious, which is essentially everything that ever happens in our lives affects us and sits in our unconscious even if we can't remember it, which is why things that happen in our childhood may be traumas even if we don't understand them. Now, where Freud and Jung separated was with this concept of the collective unconscious. Now, Jung's parents were pastors, or his dad was a pastor. His mum was the daughter of a pastor. So I guess he had more of a spiritual outlook than Freud, who was quite materialistic. And essentially, he came up with this thing, the collective unconscious, which is essentially everything that's ever happened in humanity is stored in our DNA, and we're all connected to each other through this collective unconscious. So it's a bit of a mad concept, but it's something that I believe in through the spiritual practices that I've done. So I want to start getting into some of these. So the first thing that I wanted to talk around was rebirthing breathwork. So as I said, this concept of the collective unconscious is a bit of a crazy one. From a scientific perspective, I recommend checking out the work of Joe Dispenza, who talks about accessing the pineal gland through meditation and accessing the quantum field, which is a way of getting in touch with the collective unconscious. Now, my experience, spiritual experiences, because you may think, why do I believe in the collective unconscious? Why do I believe that everything is connected? So I'll come back to something I did, Rebirthing Breathwork, and you can learn more about this type of breathwork in episode 3 of the podcast with Lucy Patterson, who is a breathwork coach. Now, in 2019, I went to do my first rebirthing breathwork with Lucy Patterson, and I drove an hour to Surrey, so that's outside London, for those of you who don't know it. And we did this session, and it was one of the most transformational things that I'd done in my life up until that point. And essentially, the way rebirthing breathwork works is you breathe in and out as deeply as you possibly can for 1 hour. Now, the difference to normal breathing is that normally we breathe in, we breathe out, and then we have a gap in our breath, but this is conscious connected breath. So you don't take a break in the breath, and you do that for an hour. Now, what happened is I started crying during this breath work. It was totally unexpected. And then I had a vision of this guy, Roy Bennett, who is someone that I used to work for. So to talk to you about Roy Bennett, before I worked in sales, I used to work in politics. And I invited this guy, Roy Bennett, to speak at a political event. He was the treasurer of the opposition in Zimbabwe, and he was fighting against Robert Mugabe. After he spoke at the event, we became friends, and then a year later, he invited me to work on the Zimbabwean election. Now, Roy was a very inspiring guy. Because he fought against Robert Mugabe's dictatorship in Zimbabwe, he was imprisoned. And he told me terrible stories around what happened in prison, that they would starve people to death. There was no toilets in his cell, so you would have 8 people in the cell, a couple people would be dead. And then there was excrement on the floor, so he was literally living in hell. But they couldn't kill him because he was so popular with the people. He actually had the nickname Pachedu, which means one of us, right, in Shona, the local language of Zimbabwe. So he was very popular among the people. A few years later, he died in a helicopter crash, I found out. And at the time I was sad, but I didn't cry or anything like that. And then during this rebirthing breathwork session, I realized even though he wasn't family, I still needed to grieve. And I cried during this process and let out some of that grief. And it was just a very transformational experience. A year later, a family member of mine was in hospital. And by this point, I'd done 3 rebirthing breathworks sessions with Lucy. Now, typically with rebirthing breathwork, you're meant to do 10 sessions before you can do it by yourself. But I was in a bit of a terrible state. A family member had had a stroke, and I was thinking, what do I do in this situation? I decided, hey, I'm going to do breathwork. But I didn't actually do rebirthing breathwork because I'd heard about holotropic breathwork from this book, The Cosmic Game, which is written by Stanislav Grof, something I highly recommend, and he had trademarked this holotropic breathwork. And it's very similar to rebirthing breathwork, but you do it with music, you move around, you dance. So anyway, I did that for an hour, and it was super transformational, even stronger than when I did the rebirthing breathwork, and I was moving around, and I felt a lot of things from my unconscious released, like anger and shame. And it was an incredible experience, and I really felt like I was tapping into this collective unconscious, as Carl Jung called it earlier. And like I said, you can have a look at Joe Dispenza, who does a lot of work on how meditation can connect you to some type of collective intelligence. Now, the way I'm talking around it, you may think, spirituality is not all love, light, and forgiveness, and it's not. There's a lot of darkness to spirituality as well. So going back to Carl Jung, you'll hear me talk about this guy a lot. I wanted to introduce this concept of the shadow. And what's interesting about the shadow is essentially the parts of our unconscious which aren't aligned to what we are aiming for, essentially, as humans, right? So another way to look at this is kind of like an inner evil that's inside of you. Now, what's interesting about the shadow is every single person in the world has their own shadow, right? However enlightened you are. And I thought I'd go back to another, spiritual practice you could look at is when I did my first ayahuasca ceremony. This was back in 2016, so about 7 years ago now. Now, I think a lot of people, when they take ayahuasca, so I'll quickly explain what it is. It's a plant medicine that comes from the Amazons, and the indigenous tribes in the Amazons have been taking it for over 10,000 years. But it's psychedelic. It has psychedelic effects. So a lot of people that go to take it, they have the wrong expectations. They think it's some type of recreational drug and they're going to trip. But actually, it's very different to that. I wouldn't say it's fun. It's more of something that's helping you confront your fears and bringing things up from your unconscious. So I think it's very much a way of like dealing with your shadow and integrating your shadow. So going on to my own experience with ayahuasca, I think before I took it, I thought evil is something outside of me, right? Darkness is something outside of me. But afterwards, I started reflecting more with myself. How am I contributing to situations, right? How can I improve this? And realizing we're never going to get rid of evil. Evil is here with us, and we need to shine a light on it to be able to deal with it. And when I did this as well, the other thing that I realized, which was really scary to start with, was that without evil, you wouldn't need light, right? Without darkness, you don't need light. And this was quite a scary thing to deal with at the start. And an analogy I give, so I talk about this a lot when I do storytelling training as a salesperson, which is that every story needs a villain, right? So if you look at something like The Lion King as an example, Scar in The Lion King is the villain, but he's also essential to the film. There's not much meaning without Scar in the film. So if you think about it, Simba has to leave Pride Land because he thinks Scar killed his father, and then later he has to come back to Pride Land to defeat Scar and save it. And I think this is actually a really good analogy, because if you think with Scar being a shadow, Simba doesn't even realize to start with that Scar killed Mufasa, killed his father, and it's only when he comes back, confronts his fears, faces his past, is that he realizes the truth, that it was actually Scar that killed his father. So this is quite an interesting analogy here. And I think this concept of the shadow is really important with where we are right now in 2023, because people are always projecting evil onto other people and they're not thinking, how can I be a better person? How can I shine light on my own darkness, understand what I can do better in these situations? And I don't need to tell you about the polarization that's happening in politics and elsewhere. People don't want to have conversations with each other. So people are more aware of their own shadow. There's going to be more dialogue, more communication in the world. And one of my purposes in life is to help myself become a better communicator, but help others become better communicators. And that's really the essence of why I like doing sales training. It helps people communicate better. On this topic of open discussions, I really liked a conversation I had with Neil Tolliday, who's one half of the big chill out band, Bent. And he's been very successful in music, but he was talking around his struggles with alcoholism and his time in rehab. And he talks about this exercise that he did in rehab that I think any of us can learn from, which is essentially they put you in pairs. You have to tell the other person what you don't like about them. Now, when you receive this feedback, instead of getting emotional, taking it personally, you just say, I understand, right? So you're taking it on the chin. And I think we need more conversations like this where we're open and frank and learn from each other and don't get offended and emotional from these conversations. And again, I think the shadow, understanding the shadow, is a really good way of doing that. Talking about confronting your fears, confronting your darkness, I wanted to talk around the concept of voluntary suffering or delayed gratification, because we live in this era of instant gratification at the moment, where you can just order anything on your phone at the click of your fingertips. I'm one of the very fortunate. I live in this incredible city, London. We've got all these different types of foods, cultures on our doorstep. And with technology, it means I can press a button, get any type of food delivered to my house. So that's an example of instant gratification. But if you think about the things that are meaningful in your life, whether that's building a business, exercise, things that create really meaningful change, they take time, right? You can't just click a button and it happens. So actually the most rewarding things is the delayed gratification. It's the opposite, but we live in this culture of like high consumption. You know, through advertising and all these things, we're being taught to consume. So this got me interested in abstinence. So after I'd worked in Berlin, that's where I invited the Zimbabwean politician to speak at this event. While I was living in Berlin, as well as working, anyone that's been to Berlin or lived in Berlin knows it's a bit of like a crazy party city. So I wasn't living the most healthy lifestyle there, drinking, doing all kinds of other stuff. And then I got back to London and I wanted to do a bit of a detox. So I decided for Lent, I'm going to give up alcohol for 6 weeks. This started a journey which led to today where I don't drink. And it was a gradual process though. It didn't happen overnight. First I did those 6 weeks, then I did 3 months, then I did 6 months. And then a few years ago, I met a crazy Scottish guy called Rory Fairbairns who runs 1 Year No Beer, who we did a great podcast with as well. He talks about his journey to sobriety from being a crazy oil broker. But through that, I decided to do 1 year, and after 1 year, I felt great and have continued to stop drinking. So that got me interested. You know, alcohol, it's made me more productive at work, it's made me fitter, it's made all kinds of things. Have a look at 1 Year No Beer, listen to that podcast, and you'll hear a lot about that. But through that journey of alcohol, I also got interested in other things to give up, other abstinence as well. And one of those things was food. So also while I was living in Berlin, I had a friend there, Adil Razlan, who is a British Syrian guy. And I was fascinated by this guy because at the time he was doing Ramadan. It would be 10 o'clock, we'd be in a bar drinking, but he was eating, he wasn't drinking, and then he would come out with us to like techno clubs till like the late hours. But he just had this really amazing vibe about him. And then when I got back to London, the year after, he was also in London as well, and I decided to do a day of fasting with him. I couldn't commit to doing the whole 30 days of Ramadan, but I did this 24 hours of fasting, and a lot of people look at, you know, Ramadan fasting as something backward, but what I did, I broke fast with him and his community, and I definitely felt this collective spirit together as they were all going through this voluntary suffering, and it was a really beautiful moment. And again, taking this away from the spiritual, thinking around like health benefits, there's huge health benefits to fasting, whether that's reducing inflammation, whether that's helping diabetes patients to lower insulin. So fasting is not just a spiritual thing, there's also huge health benefits to it. And now I regularly do 24-hour fasts, and it also got me thinking more around like Christianity, and you know, we generally do 6 weeks of Lent and you just give up one thing. Whereas I think it's a bit of a cop-out compared to, you know, what Muslims are doing. So, you know, these 24-hour fasts, and obviously intermittent fasting is a huge thing nowadays, and it can be really beneficial, and it's been very beneficial for me. So the last Carl Jung concept I wanted to bring up was the anima and the animus. So essentially, this is that the anima is the female part of the male psyche, and the animus is the male part of the female psyche. Now, I'm going to try and explain what this is by going back to stories with the Lion King. So if you go back to the Lion King, when Nala goes to get Simba, Simba's living this life with Timon and Pumbaa, Hakuna Matata, no worries about a thing, he's chilling out, but there's not that much purpose to his life, right? He's just in the jungle eating bugs. And then Nala comes along and says, what are you doing here? You've got to come back to Pride Land. You've got to come back and save our kingdom. And at first, Simba's like, no, there's no way I can do that. One, Nala doesn't know about my past and all this stuff. But eventually she convinces him to confront his fears, his shadow, right, his past. So he goes back to Pride Land and he defeats Scar and he confronts his fears and he has enlightenment and becomes king, right? Now, the reason I'm talking around this is a common story of the anima, right? Which is you have these female figures in a male person's life that help them confront their past, help them confront their fears. So what's been really interesting about doing the podcast is we've had loads of stories like this, right? And the female figure doesn't necessarily need to be a romantic person, because I'll talk about Kawan Glover, who was on the show, and he was a guy that had every right to have a culture of like victimhood, right? Because he had multiple brain surgeries, strokes, and he was only in his early 20s. He was like 21 at university. And then his grandma actually said to him, hey, why don't you write a book about this? And now he writes a book which is anti-victim mindset, saying, hey, if I was able to get through this, anyone can get through it. So he had his grandma inspiring him. We also had Ian Koniak, who was talking about his porn addiction, and his wife helped him through that. And Dale Dupree talked around how his wife helped him get over his depression. So there's been these incredible stories of anima figures who are helping men come through some of these times and essentially confronting your shadow. So this is one of the responsibilities of the anima in the male psyche, is to confront your shadow. But what I wanted to do, I'm not going to talk about the animus because I'm not a woman, but the animus has a role in helping women as well. But if you look at the yin and yang symbol, if you see those white dots, you've got the white dot in the black circle and the black dot on the other side. Those are integrated, but that's not always the case, right? So the anima is not always a positive force, and there can be this thing called the devouring mother. And if you think a mother who is overly protective of her child, doesn't let the child like out into the open when they're old and have their own life, then they become the devouring mother, and that's kind of called anima possession. But I don't want to go into that too much today. I want to come on to what I call Taoism, right, which is an ancient religion from China. It's as old as Christianity, and talk about like the natural balance of things. So going back to my story, I used to live in Medellin in Colombia for 3 years. I used to live in Spain and Madrid, and my partner Anna is from Ecuador. So by learning Spanish, I actually learned about some of this balance, because I learned around, in Spanish, every noun has a gender. So talking around how this ties into Taoism and balance and the cosmic bridge is el cielo means the sky, and that's masculine. And then you have la tierra, which is the earth, and that's feminine. That's why a lot of indigenous people call earth Mother Earth or Pachamama. And if you think these two things are in perfect harmony, and as humans we need both. We need the sky to have rain, so it nourishes the soil, and that means we can eat. So we've got those two things. Another example is el sol, which is the sun, and el dia, which is the day. And then you've got la noche, which is the night, and la luna, which is the moon. And if you think about it, when the sun goes down, daytime stops, then it's nighttime and you have the moon, and these two things are in balance with each other. And then a good example, what you're trying to do in Taoism, if you think about the yin and yang, is that line in the middle. And if you look at a sunset or a sunrise, so I'm sure if you're listening to this at some point in your life, you've seen a really amazing sunset or a really amazing sunrise. And the reason that that's beautiful is it's that middle ground. It's that bit in the middle where the night meets the day, and then you kind of stop and you're like, wow, that's incredible. So that is really the cosmic bridge, right? That's the feeling that you're trying to create there. So that's it. That's the cosmic bridge. I've said a little bit about my own story, a little bit philosophical, talking about crazy stories with Carl Jung. What I wanted to say is I think there's two types of people in this world to finish. Some people think, oh, I've lived my life, I know everything, I haven't got that much to learn. Whereas the others is life is this infinite game. There's so many things we can learn. And even though I'm very stubborn a lot of the time, I try to be like the second person. And Socrates has got that quote, I know that I know nothing. So if you have any feedback at all, please leave it in the comments. Feel free to drop me a message on LinkedIn or email me. If there's anyone you think would be interested in hearing this podcast, feel free to share it with them, and please subscribe to us on YouTube and across podcast platforms. Cheers.